Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. We have a special treat for you. I'm joined, as I always am, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. But we also have a special guest or co-host, Donald J. Boudreaux, who teaches economics at George Mason. And both of them are former presidents of the Foundation for Economic Education. I'm a former program director at that fine institution. So we got all three of us here together to talk about some economic issues. Richard, welcome.
Great to be here with our viewers and listeners as always. And it's wonderful to have you joining us today, Don. Thank you for finding the time to do it.
Oh, yeah. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you, Don. You know, what really inspired me to have you on as a guest was a column that you wrote about free trade, which you've been writing a lot about, especially in the context of the Trump administration, but also the work that you've done on the minimum wage, which for some reason continues to be devilish. You would think by this time these two issues, minimum wage and free trade, would be settled. But why don't you kick it off, Don, and let's start with the minimum wage. Tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing, the perspectives you have in here, and the challenges that you think we face on this issue.
I often get criticized for writing so much about the minimum wage, but the reason I write so much about the minimum wage is that the issue doesn't go away. People on the left keep bringing it up. They keep endorsing it. There are continued calls for it to be raised at the national level. At the local and state level, minimum wages are rising all the time. As I see it, it's just basic economics. By the way, I believe that the bulk of what's worthwhile and useful to know in economics, you can get about 90% of it in a very good introductory economics course. I truly believe that. Everything else is icing on the cake. So anyway, basic economics teaches that when the cost of pursuing some action goes up, people will pursue that action less vigorously. They'll do it less frequently. They'll take that action less frequently. And so when you raise the cost of hiring low-skilled workers, which is what the minimum wage does, employers economize more on those workers. They move out of those workers. They employ fewer of those workers. It's true, some workers get higher wages, but that doesn't come without a cost. Some workers lose their jobs. This seems to me to be eminent common sense. It seems to me to be indisputable from the economic point of view. We can argue about how big the effect is, but what I argue against is not the view that the effect isn't big. I argue against the view of people who hold that there is no negative effect at all. Most people think that if you raise the minimum wage, all that means is that businesses will just pay their workers more, and that's the end of the story. And of course, that's just ridiculous, because most of the businesses where low-skilled workers are employed are also businesses that operate in extraordinarily competitive output markets. Retail, restaurants, cleaning services, lawn care services. These are not businesses with huge profit margins. And so when you raise their costs, they are going to find some way to economize on the cost of their inputs, and that will mean creating fewer jobs, eliminating some jobs in those industries. And so the myth that you can raise the minimum wage without destroying jobs is one that for some reason people continue to wallow in. They do not want to let go of it, and I keep hammering away on it whenever I get an opportunity to do so.
Richard?
Yeah, if I can just compliment that. First of all, I totally agree, Don, that if you have students as a captive audience for a semester, especially in a micro class, at the end of that semester, you should have been able to free them from the vast majority of the economic myths and delusions that affect public policy. Because you just explained the logic of demand to any student. Yeah. That is that people, other things held given, tend to buy less when the price goes up, and they tend to buy more when the price goes down. And that is influenced by willingness and ability. Yeah. Now, I explain to my students that where does the businessman get the money from which he can pay any of those he employs? from the revenues from selling products to consumers. Therefore, he has to ask himself, is the value added that this worker is contributing to the production process, and therefore his ability to market his product at a price that he thinks consumers are willing to pay, if he thinks the value added is less than what the government mandates he must pay as a wage, then it should not be surprising that some workers will be let off, or some workers who, let's say, retire or move on for whatever reason, are not replaced. Yeah. This means that you're pricing them out of the market. I ask the students again, if you go into the clothing section of a department store and you see a nice looking jacket, but then you turn over the ticket and see what the price is, you may say, ouch. And that's for two reasons. Either it's beyond your financial ability, your budget constraint, or you say to yourself, I could afford it, but I don't think it's worth the opportunity cost. That is what I could do with my money instead, spent in an alternative direction, given that I don't have money to buy all the things that I can conceivably desire to my heart's content. The businessman is in the same position. So if you want to harm some of the very people who you say you're concerned on Cafe Hayek, by the way, is that we're talking often about low-skilled young labor. And how can anyone have a chance to get the on-the-job skills, training, interactive working experience if they can't get their foot on the bottom rung of that ladder of improved success? Because otherwise you can't gain the skills and abilities and experience that will make you hopefully more valuable down the road. Yep. So by imposing a minimum wage, you prevent some people from never getting on that ladder and therefore perpetuate the misfortune and the poverty and the low skills that the advocates of minimum wage so bemoan.
Yeah, I regard that as the single worst effect of the minimum wage. It's not the lost income of the people who lose their jobs. In a lot of cases, it's always an unfortunate outcome, but I think in a lot of cases the biggest loss is the ability to, as you put it, get your foot on the first rung of the ladder. And so the 17-year-old who would today have a higher paying job because he had a year's worth of experience working is today, because he or she has been unemployed for the past year due to the minimum wage, is still a completely unskilled worker with no track record, and that goes on indefinitely for a lot of these workers. It's as my colleague Walter Williams says, it's an anti-black law, or we can generalize. It's an anti-minority law. If you really want to hurt blacks, you want to hurt Hispanics, you want to hurt people who are the most unskilled and least attractive workers, pass the minimum wage. Then you'll do it.
Yeah, the best proof of that phenomenon is the statistic. I mean, the black inner city teenager has a chronic, permanent unemployment rate of about 30 to 40%, year after year. I mean, it's just there.
Thomas Sowell, rather, Walter Williams also notes this. The last year on record for which blacks ages 16 to 17 had a lower unemployment rate than whites of the same age, so these are teenagers, unskilled in both cases, was 1948. Now, the reason that year is important is because 1948 is really the year when the federal minimum wage kicked in. It was enacted in 1938, but because of the intervening war period and the wartime economy, it didn't really get going as a binding constraint until after World War II. And then what we've seen since after World War II is that the unemployment rate of both groups has risen, but the unemployment rate of blacks has risen at a much faster rate. Now, most people would try to explain this trend by saying racial prejudice, but that just doesn't pass the smell test. However racially prejudiced Americans are today, we're not as racially prejudiced as were Americans in 1948. And yet in 1948, young blacks had a slightly lower rate of unemployment than did young whites.
Well, and actually, yeah, go ahead, Richard.
I was just going to say, is to reinforce that, as both Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams have pointed out, is that one of the reasons why black youth unemployment and black unemployment in general tended to be lower than whites in those earlier times was precisely to the degree that racial prejudice did exist.
Right.
And if you had a white person and a black person and you could hire one or the other, and you'd prefer the one that you felt racially more comfortable with, what the black person could do is to make himself price competitive, You may not like me. You may not want to have me around, but I'll work 10 cents less an hour than that guy. Now put your racial prejudice where your pocketbook is. And that now you could say from a wider perspective, why should a man have to offer himself at a lower price merely because of the color of his skin? And from a wider philosophical point of view, we would say that it shouldn't have to be that in the best of all worlds. But given the reality of who people are and were at historical periods, and if you want someone to at least have a chance to overcome the prejudices of others, market price competition gave an avenue for people to overcome their disadvantage in that way. But the enforcement of the minimum wage did away with that and has exacerbated this unemployment problem.
Yeah, it's basically removed the cost or dramatically reduced the cost of exercising prejudice of whatever sort.
Well, and it actually even does worse than that. That if a black teenager comes to an employer and says, "Look, I'm willing to work for $2 an hour. I want to learn to be an apprentice with you for a year. I want to learn work skills. I want to learn how to treat customers. I want to learn how the business operates, and I'm willing to take a loss. I'm living at home. My parents are giving me my meals." And just give me a chance to get my foot in the door. The law prohibits the employer from hiring him. Even if the employer says, "I want to hire you, I can make money off you with $2 an hour," the law prohibits him from doing so. And if he does anyway, he subjects himself to tremendous financial penalties imposed by the U.S. government. I think totaling triple the amount of the regular wages that the employee would ordinarily make under the minimum wage. So employers are going to sit there and say, man, as much as I would like to hire you, I'm not going to take the chance. And so the law prohibits them from doing so.
Yeah. That's exactly right, Bumper. Let me just say one other thing. So, certainly as Richard knows, there's this debate that's been raging in economics now over the empirics of the minimum wage. So people go out and they gather data, and some people find that, yes, you raise the minimum wage, unemployment of low-skilled workers rises. Other people say, no. If you control just right, you do all these fancy statistical and econometric tricks, then we discover that really the minimum wage has no effect on employment. And again, that just doesn't pass the smell test. We have to. Where does the money come from to pay these extra workers? But there are some empirical studies that find that there's no effect. And one thing I like to point out, in addition to saying, well, but there are a lot of studies that do find a negative effect, is that we've had a minimum wage now in the United States at the federal level for going on 80 years. And employers know this. And so employers have had a long time to adjust the way they structure their operations and their employment situations in anticipation of the minimum wage. And so employers have long ago adapted to the existence of a minimum wage. And so when you get small changes in the minimum wage today, it's not surprising that the effects on employment are pretty small. They're still there, I believe, but they're pretty small. A true test would be if we get rid of the minimum wage and do it in a way that we commit to get rid of it for good. What I anticipate is that once employers internalize the fact that, well, we've gotten rid of the minimum wage, then we'd see employment of teenagers, particularly of Black and Hispanic teenagers, rise dramatically. And so that would be a great benefit to those young people. But unfortunately, that's politically not going to happen because people on the right and the left like the minimum wage because they don't really understand the economics behind it.
Well, what amazes me is there's so many people who honestly think that by simply passing a law that you can make a nation wealthy, that you can increase people's standard of living. I mean, if that were the case, there wouldn't be any poor nations around the world because everybody knows that if you raise the minimum wage, supposedly good things are going to happen. This is going to be a bountiful society. Yet we know that's clearly not the case. And then another interesting question that, of course, the one that I learned when I was first getting into all this many years ago was, why do they limit the minimum wage to, $10 an hour, $15 an hour? Why don't they make it $100 an hour, $200 an hour?
What the more sophisticated minimum wage proponents say is, no, that reductio ad absurdum doesn't work because the minimum wage, and you can draw a model, a valid economic model to show this. If an employer has what's called monopsony power, monopoly over hiring workers, then it's possible. I think it's highly unlikely, but then it's possible for a small forced increase in the wage, such as the minimum wage, to not cause any resulting unemployment. Now, the conditions have to be just right, but it's absurd to think that employers of low-skilled workers have a monopoly over the hiring of these workers. Restaurants are a common employer of minimum wage workers, of low-skilled workers. Restaurants pop up all the time. For all the faults we have in the American economy, and gosh knows we all agree that there are lots of faults, lots of things that can be improved. I don't believe that monopoly in retailing, monopsony in retailing, or monopsony in lawn care services is among the problems. And so there's a highly competitive market for low-skilled workers, and which means that when you raise the minimum wage, some of them are going to lose their jobs.
Right. You see, but that's the fact that the advocates of minimum wage use often these peculiar and very narrowly defined exceptions in their model demonstrates the commonsensical irrelevancy of them. It's the analogy of an international trade theory where you can come up with particular specified assumptions that terms of trade can be manipulated and will only have good effects and no bad effects.
Yeah.
But we all know that in the real world, like you're talking about the general retail market, that's not the circumstances in which most trade, the vast majority of trade, occurs, whether the country is big or small.
Yeah.
So it's an irrelevant case. But the problem is, by finding hypothetical exceptions to the general rule, then it's sort of like a foot in the door to then find more exceptions to justify intervention after intervention, and you lose the general case in which it's absurd to do it.
Yeah. I am convinced. I argue with minimum wage proponents a lot, both economists who support the minimum wage and non-economists, and I'm convinced that I think most of these people are well-meaning in a sense, but they grasp for rationales to justify their policy. Oh, look, this study shows that it didn't increase employment. Oh, look, there can be monopsony in the labor market. And if you are committed to believing that a policy is worthwhile, you can convince yourself that there are situations in the real world that justify it. But I know we all have our biases, and I certainly have my own. But I'm not going to abandon a basic core principle of economics, namely the law of demand, because that's pretty fundamental. As my late colleague Jim Buchanan said, I think it was in a letter to the Wall Street Journal many years ago when this minimum wage debate first got raging. He said, look, if it's true that the minimum wage doesn't cause any unemployment, then that means that the law of demand is inoperative, and that means that all of economics is useless. I don't believe that, and I believe that the law of demand remains a fundamental feature of human reality, and that means if you raise the minimum wage, some workers are going to lose their job. It's as simple as that.
All right, let's move on to the other issue, Richard, that we want to discuss, and that's the concept of free trade that Don's done a lot of work on. First of all, Richard, you mentioned something called Cafe Hayek. Don, would you tell us what Cafe Hayek is?
Yeah, it's my blog. It's technically a blog I do with Russ Roberts, but Russ hasn't blogged in quite a long time, so it's become de facto my own blog. It's www.cafehayek.com, and I just, as you guys, I write mostly about the minimum wage and about trade, and it's an especially target-rich environment today on the trade front because the Republican Party, unfortunately, has returned to its historical roots. A lot of people don't realize that the Republican Party originally was the party of protection, and Donald Trump is saying everything that Abraham Lincoln would have said, or Benjamin Harrison said, or William McKinley said, and that makes it both a frustrating time for someone who knows economics, because all of the things that are said by these people are maddeningly mistaken. But it's also, in a way, an invigorating time because there is no end to opportunities to try to teach economics on this important front.
All All right, so give us your case for free trade.
Before getting to the trade, Jacob, I insist upon giving Don a bigger plug.
Okay.
With Cafe Hayek. Viewers and listeners, if you're not familiar with Don's writings and offerings on Cafe Hayek, take advantage of them. He not only offers his own great commentaries, and I mean that sincerely, very insightful, to the point, and clear, but he offers every day extremely valuable and useful links to a wide variety of other policy issue articles,
including some of Richard's
that the average reader otherwise might not know about. And that is a yeoman service that you do virtually every day. And viewers and listeners, take advantage of what he makes available to those concerned with freedom issues.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's cafehayek.com?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Don, give us the case for free trade. I mean, we're living in an era of trade wars and tariffs and sanctions and embargoes, and those of us that have been advocating for free trade, sometimes I feel like we're a voice crying through the darkness here. Give us the case for free trade.
That when two people choose to voluntarily trade with each other, they both expect to gain, and that fact is not altered if you put a political border between those two people. That's it. That is the case. If you and I want to trade, you think it's a good deal to trade with me, I think it's a good deal to trade with you. What difference does it make if you live in a different state or a different country or on a different planet, for that matter? We are each the best judges of our economic welfare and whether or not a trade will improve our economic welfare. Of course, we can make mistakes. That's always true. But there's nothing about a political border that makes trades that would otherwise be beneficial and acceptable somehow suspect or unacceptable. And when people get their judgment gets distorted by political borders. They somehow think that political borders have some economic meaning that political borders don't have. The existing producers in each economy can take advantage of this economic ignorance and say, oh, yes, you have to protect our country from those foreign goods, as if foreign goods are like little invading bacteria or invading viruses that destroy us. Foreigners can't sell anything to us that we don't voluntarily choose to buy. How are we harmed by that? We're not harmed by that at all. Of course, when people buy more imports, they may buy fewer things produced domestically. But any time people change the way that they spend their money, some jobs are destroyed and other jobs are created. There's nothing unique about trading internationally that destroys jobs or that creates jobs. And so the basic economic case for free trade can be summarized. You can say it a lot of different ways, but one way to summarize it is forget the notion that political borders have economic meaning. They do not. They are not economically significant.
Richard?
Right. This is the argument. I totally concur with everything Don said. This has been the argument since the time of 250 years ago with David Hume, with Adam Smith, the physiocrats of France, their contemporaries. With the idea is that as Smith says in The Wealth of Nations, a wise man never makes himself what he can buy more cheaply from his neighbor. And no kingdom can act any more wisely or less wisely if they don't take advantage of goods that other countries can produce better or cheaper than their own countrymen can. Because you see that there's this idea that well, we use this example, of Joe versus Smith trading, but that's different than nations. But the point is, this is conceptual realism. This is the fantasy as if nations exist separate from the individuals that comprise them. Yeah. To say that Sam, Bob, Bill, and Jones are trading with people in another country just means just people. And all of those individual trades cumulatively add up to what may be the trade between one nation and another. But it is ultimately individuals trading. And no person gives up what they value more highly for something that they value less highly. And trades only continue for as long as at least both of the traders believe they're better off, and stops when one of them no longer feels that way. If one understands that fundamental core and then extends it to division of labor and the benefits and efficiencies from specialization, then the logic of free trade follows through. Now, why is there this opposition to freedom of trade? Well, it's the one that Adam Smith talked about when he explained his own frustrations about whether Great Britain would ever see free trade, even with his attempt to justify and explain it. and that is the prejudices of the public and the powers of the interests. By prejudice of the public is that very point that arose with the minimum wage too, the difficulty of people to understand and follow the steps of the economic logic. But the powers of the interests are what's really a danger, which Smith understood, and that all the vested interests who are fearful and afraid of having to face competitors who may make the less expensive product, the better product, the new product, that their former established clientele might prefer to buy instead. So it is the less efficient competitor attempting to use the state to keep out a more efficient rival from making their wares available to the general public.
Yep. I agree with everything Richard says, not surprisingly. Every spring semester, I teach a seminar on the Wealth of Nations. So the students and I, we read the Wealth of Nations cover to cover. And the thing that astonishes me, well, not astonishes, the thing that strikes me every semester, and particularly now, is how the same arguments that Adam Smith addressed are the same arguments being made now. The arguments being made now are not more sophisticated. They're not different. They are the same arguments. In every way, they are the same arguments. And yet, the popular understanding seems not to have improved in the 241 years since the publication of The Wealth of Nations. Why that's so, I don't know. Richard points to the power of special interest groups, and I agree with that. They have an interest in stoking this economic ignorance and certainly riding it to the extent that it exists. But nothing. If you resurrected Adam Smith today and you had him listen to Donald Trump and Donald Trump's advisors on trade, he wouldn't be surprised. He would say, "Hey, this is the same stuff that I heard back in the mid-18th century."
Yeah, the problem we face is that there's no freedom gene. That is that merely because Sally and Bob learned the principles of free enterprise and free trade by taking a Don Boudreaux course at GMU, doesn't mean that their children just get it through the genetic strain. Every generation has to undertake the intellectual exercise of being introduced to and learning these lessons. And alas, there seems to be something in the human psyche, and I don't claim to be the psychologist, that makes the default position more likely to take these tribalistic notions of us versus them, my nation versus the other, et cetera, that makes this a bias that every generation has to somehow overcome by that same new generation having enough spokesmen and articulators of free enterprise and free trade to make the case for it once more.
Well said. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's especially true here in the United States because we are the living example of free trade. I mean, we live in the largest free trade zone in history. Also, open borders. I mean, people are free in Virginia to trade with people in California. No trade restrictions.
Right.
People don't worry about whether there's an imbalance of trade between California and Virginia. Nobody even thinks about it, that we might be sending them more money than they're sending us. All that people think about is, hey, I'm free to consume goods from anywhere in the country. And all that a person has to do is just apply that principle internationally, that when you are being provided with goods and services from all over the world, you don't have to buy them. But the fact that they're being offered to you gives you the opportunity to increase your standard of living. And that's one of the major points I think we need to remember is that when you enter into a trade with another person, your standard of living has just increased as a result of that trade because you've gotten something you value more for something that you value less.
Yep. And you asked for my summary of the case for free trade earlier, and I gave the economic summary. But I want to say ultimately, there's an ethical. Ultimately, I favor free trade because it's ethically correct. It's none of the government's business who I buy from and who I sell to. It's my business, and as long as I am peacefully pursuing my business, I reject the argument that someone else can ethically interfere. They can certainly practically interfere. They can stick a gun in my face and prevent me from doing so, or punitively tax me for doing so. And I may obey, but that's only because I want to save my life, save my skin. But ethically, no one has a right to interfere with the peaceful commerce that individuals choose to engage in. And the fact that a political border separates the traders does not change the ethics of the matter any more than it changes the economics of the matter.
Yes, but because to the extent that the state does this, the state is taking the presumption that you are the property of the state.
Yeah.
As if through the democratized process, monarchy still prevails. The king owns the land, the resources, and the people in the territory of which he has jurisdiction. And the presumption is that even in the democratic state, when the monarch is gone, the people, through their representatives, have the authority to tell people with whom they can trade, with whom they can have dealings, what they can produce, what they can charge, and so on. So it is a denial of liberty by the presumption that the state, in some sense, owns you and therefore dictates what human associations and relationships you should have, which runs counter, absolutely, to the founding principles of this country, as stated, for instance, in the Declaration of Independence.
Such a quaint document. Yeah, no, I agree completely. Yeah.
Yeah, and the moral argument also applies to the minimum wage that we were discussing earlier. It's my money. Why shouldn't I be free to spend it any way I want? Why shouldn't I be free to hire whomever I want? It's my business. It's my money. Same thing with trade. Why shouldn't I be free to use my money the way I want to use it?
And as a worker, it's your time. It's your body. You can choose. It's no one's business who you choose to work for and on what terms, as long as what you're doing is peaceful. And this is not a philosophically complex matter, but as Richard points out, unfortunately there is no freedom. There is no freedom gene. So we have to, through methods like you guys do so well, we have to keep making the case again and again and again.
All right. On that sound note, we have to wrap it up. We're about out of time. Don, thanks so much for joining us. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Richard, always a pleasure. Thanks, sir, for coming on.
You, Richard.
Great for you having you join us, Don. I hope you will again sometime in the future.
I'd love to. I'd love to.
And thank you, our viewers, for tuning in.